Hi. We're continuing reading Paul's letter to the Galatians. Last time we read uh, most of the first chapter, and in that chapter there was his salutation and indicating that this is a letter to the churches in Galatia. And we decided that we're going to read this to mean the churches that he and Barnabas visited on their first missionary journey in what is known as South Galatia. And we also decided that it is most likely that he wrote this just before he and Barnabas went to Jerusalem for a council that is recorded in Acts 15. They had already, Paul had already visited Jerusalem twice, and he tells us about that in this letter to the Galatians. Also in chapter 1, he rebukes the Galatians. He says, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you. And he is very blunt here, saying, if anyone teaches you a gospel different than the one that we taught you, let him be accursed. Now, as we look at this, it's clear that Paul is responding to accusations that have been brought against him by some people. He doesn't tell us exactly what those accusations are, but he responds to them, and so we can figure it out. Evidently, among other things, they had claimed that he was a man pleaser, that is, that he was compromising his gospel in order to win Gentile converts easily. And so in verse 10 of chapter 1, it says, am I now seeking human approval or God's approval? And he says that right after he says, if anyone's teaching you a gospel other than the one I shared with you, let him be accursed. He's making it pretty clear he's not trying to please anyone. And then in verse 11 of chapter 1, he said, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel that was proclaimed by me is not of human origin. And so now he begins to tell us where he got the gospel, where he got this message. And still there in chapter 1, starting in verse 13, he says, you've undoubtedly heard about my progress in Judaism when I was, before I became a Christian, and how I was very zealous for Judaism, even persecuting the Church of God. But then he says, but Jesus revealed himself to me. And we know from other accounts, especially in the book of Acts, that this happened on his way to Damascus, as he was going to Damascus in order to arrest believers there. He says that basically in verse 16. He says, reading part of verse 15 of chapter 1, he says, God was pleased through his grace to reveal his son to me so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles. And then he says, I did not confer with any human being, and I didn't go up to Jerusalem at that time. So this experience on the road to Damascus was very clear to him. He knew that it was Jesus and that he had given him a mission to go to the Gentiles, and he understood what the gospel was. He didn't go up to Jerusalem to get the nitty-gritty on it, because somehow or other Jesus revealed it to him. Instead of going to Jerusalem, he said, I went away at once into Arabia, and afterwards I returned to Damascus. So leaving Damascus, he went south. N.T. Wright says that it's likely that he went all the way down to Mount Sinai, which is even further south than Jerusalem, but it's not on the west side of the Jordan River. He would have stayed on the east side of the Jordan and gone even further down below the Dead Sea. So that's what he did instead of going to Jerusalem. He went to Arabia. He was probably preaching along the way, but he was probably also communing with Jesus. And Jesus was probably showing him more of the mystery of this new gospel. Now, we come to verse 18 in chapter 1. And this is the beginning of part 2. And at this point, he is still telling his story. Now, if we put this in context, he's been accused. In the ancient world, this was called categoria. Categoria was an accusation that was brought against someone. So he's responding to a categoria, to an accusation that he's a false teacher. And the response to a categoria is an apologia. Apologia, or in modern English, we call it an apology, but what it means is a response to an accusation. And so one of the first things he does in his response to the accusation, in his apologia, is to tell his story. And in ancient rhetoric, this was known as the part of the apologia that is the narratio, or the narration, or story. So he's telling us a story. He's already told us the story about experiencing Jesus, that revelation, and about his going down to Arabia. And now he continues with his narratio, with his story. He says in verse 18, "Then after 3 years, I did go up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and stayed with him 15 days. So Cephas is another name for Peter. And in fact, here in Galatians, Paul refers to Peter as Cephas. And so he says after 3 years, so there's 3 years of being in Arabia and then going back to Damascus. There were 3 years before he went up to Jerusalem. Up to Jerusalem is another way of saying going to where kind of the authority of the Judaism is, and so on. And he went to visit Cephas, and he stayed only 15 days. So it wasn't terribly long. But I did not see any other apostle except James, the Lord's brother. This is not James, the son of Zebedee. James, the son of Zebedee, was executed, you'll remember. Right now I'm trying to remember if he was executed before this visit or if it was after it. But anyway, it wasn't James, the son of Zebedee, that he saw on this visit. It was the brother of Jesus that he saw. And then he says, "In what I am writing to you, before God, I do not lie." So he wants to assure him he's telling the true story, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, we might say. I do not lie. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia. So he doesn't say much about that 15-day visit. That just says that he was there and he met Cephas and he met James, the Lord's brother. And then he went to the area of Syria and Cilicia. And that's up around Tarsus, where he grew up. And we don't know much about the time that he spent up in Tarsus, but we do learn here in just a verse or two that he was up there for 14 years. But he says, when he left to go up there, I was still unknown by sight to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. So each village would have had a group of believers, and each group of believers in a particular village would have been called a church. That's what Paul is saying. But he didn't go visit the churches of Galatia or the villages. So they didn't see him, and they didn't know him by sight. They had only heard that the one who formerly was persecuting us is now proclaiming the faith he once tried to destroy. And they glorified God because of me. Okay, so that's the first visit that Paul has with Cephas. And 3 years after his conversion, and it evidently was not in order to find out what the gospel was. He already knew what the gospel was. But some theologians do say that it may have been during this first visit that Peter told him about Jesus blessing the bread and blessing the wine and telling them to celebrate what we sometimes call the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. that this may have been the time that he got from Peter what happened that night before Jesus was arrested. Anyway, then now in chapter 2, verse 1, we go on to the second encounter that Peter has, or that Paul has with Cephas. Then, after 14 years, so after 14 years, after he went back up to Tarsus, after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. So 3 of them went to Jerusalem. Barnabas, we know, was a Jew because he is the one, as tells us in book of Acts, that actually went up to get Paul to come back and help him in Antioch among the Christians there. But Titus is not a Jew. He's a Gentile. And Paul goes on in verse 2 to say, I went up in response to a revelation. So the Lord told him that he should go up to Jerusalem. And so that's why the 3 of them go up to Jerusalem. Then I laid before them, though only in private, meeting with the acknowledged leaders, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles. So in a private meeting with the apostles, many of whom had probably come back to Jerusalem after the initial persecution, he laid before them the gospel that he was preaching. He told them, this is what I tell the Gentiles. I tell them about Jesus dying for us and about being saved by faith, by grace. It's a gift of God. And so on. He just laid out the gospel message that he shares with the Gentiles. And he says, he did that in order to make sure that I was not running or had run in vain. So to a certain degree, he wanted to be sure that they didn't find anything objectionable with this gospel that he was preaching. And then in verse 3, he says, but even Titus, who was with me, was not compelled to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. So the topic of circumcision, that people have to be circumcised in order to be Christians. You have to become a Jew before you can become a Christian. Or if you become a Christian and you're a Gentile, then you also need to be circumcised. You need to follow the law. But that didn't come up. Nobody said that Titus needed to be circumcised. But because a false believer secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy on the freedom we have in Christ Jesus, so that they might enslave us, but we did not submit to them, to those spies, even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might always remain with you. And from those who were supposed to be acknowledged leaders, what they actually were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those leaders contributed nothing to me. So this is a convoluted sentence, but basically what he's saying is that we went up there because people came in and tried to spy out the freedom that we have, that the Gentile Christians are not following the law of Moses, and they're not being circumcised and doing all the things that the law says that they're supposed to do. They were spying out that freedom that the Gentiles had. But Paul said, we didn't give in to him for a minute. But then he finally gets done with his long parenthesis, and he says, but those leaders, those to whom I had laid out the gospel that I was preaching, they contributed nothing to me. So they didn't add anything. They were satisfied with the message that he was sharing. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter, making him an apostle to the circumcised, also worked through me in sending me to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who were acknowledged pillars, recognized the grace that had been given to me, they gave to Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. So they came to an agreement in this private meeting with the elders. First of all, they agreed that the gospel that Paul was preaching was full and complete, wasn't leaving anything out. Titus didn't need to be circumcised, and they recognized that Paul had been given a commission to go to the Greeks, to the Gentiles, and they agreed that should be his and Barnabas's primary mission, to go to the Gentiles, whereas Peter and the other apostles, their mission would be to go primarily to the Jewish people. And then they shook hands and they agreed to be in fellowship with one another. The only thing that they did do was this: they asked only one thing, that we remember the poor, which was actually what I was eager to do. And so that second meeting with Peter up in Jerusalem, they added nothing to him. They didn't contest any of his teaching, didn't try to get Titus circumcised, but they did ask, please remember the poor. Well, in the book of Acts, we know that that Paul and Barnabas went up to Jerusalem with a gift for the poor. And it is probably that trip that they took with the gift for the poor in Jerusalem that we just read about, although he doesn't talk about that here, other than to say that they were eager to bring help for the poor there in Jerusalem. Okay, so that was Paul's second encounter with Peter. And now, starting in verse 11, we come to Paul's third encounter with Peter. And this one's, that's sort of surprising. He confronts Peter. Evidently, after Paul and Barnabas returned to Antioch, Peter, sometime later, came to Antioch too, maybe to see what was going on. But he stayed there for a while, and he was fellowshipping with the believers and the Gentile believers and eating with them and so on. But something happened. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood self-condemned. For until certain people came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. So when Cephas first came, he fellowshiped with the Gentiles. But then some people from James, that is from Jerusalem, and from James, the Lord's brother, came down, and they're very legalistic. When they came, Peter drew back. He drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. He didn't want to offend those people who came from James. So he stopped fellowshipping with the Gentile believers, wouldn't eat with them at table. And the other Jews joined him in the hypocrisy. There were Jewish Christians there in Antioch, and they withdrew with Peter, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. So all the Jewish believers stopped having table fellowship with the Gentile believers because they were afraid of the Judaizers, even Barnabas. And Paul calls it hypocrisy. He says they were play acting. They didn't really believe this. They were just doing it out of fear. They were probably not only afraid of the Judaizers, but there was also some persecution going on at this time by Jewish zealots who were persecuting any Jews, especially back in Jerusalem, who were fraternizing with Gentiles. And so there was fear both of the Judaizing party and of these zealots. But when I saw that they were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, so right in front of everybody, you can almost imagine it. They're together in a big room, and the Jews go off into one table and sit down to eat, and the Gentiles are left at the other table to eat. And Paul looks at this and says, this isn't right. But what does he say? He said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? Here you are over there not eating with them because you are pretending that now you think they need to become Jewish before you can eat with them. In other words, they need to be circumcised, the men need to be circumcised, and they need to start following the law in order to have fellowship with them. And Paul says, you don't live that way. Why are you trying to compel Gentiles to live that way? Now, on verse 15, some commentators break it at that point and say that Paul is moving on away from his narratio, away from his story, into a more doctrinal part. And it certainly is doctrine that we get here in verses 15 to the end of chapter 2. But I think we can read it as what Paul said to Peter on that time, continuing to explain why he was upset, or at least what he should have said when he was talking to Peter at that time. But let's read it as though he is still talking to Peter. He says, "We ourselves are Jews, you and me, Peter. We're Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners. Yet we know that a person is justified not by the works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ." You and I both know that, Peter. We've agreed on that before. It's not by the works of the law, it's by faith in Jesus Christ. And we have come to believe in Christ Jesus, so that we might be justified by faith in Christ and not by doing the works of the law, because no one will be justified by the works of the law. We agree with this. You can't be justified by keeping the law. You just can't be perfect enough to do that. You can only be saved and justified through Jesus. But if in our effort to be justified in Christ, we ourselves have been found to be sinners, is Christ then a servant of sin? Certainly not. So some people were saying, well, what you're saying is that Christ seems to be a servant of sin because you have to acknowledge that you're a sinner in order to be saved, and that you don't have to follow the law anymore because you're saved by Jesus, and so he must be promoting sin. And Paul says, is that what we're saying? He says, certainly not. That's not what we're saying. But if I build again the very things that I once tore down, that is, if I rebuild the law, now that I've been saved through faith and I've left the law behind, if I rebuild it, then I demonstrate that I am a transgressor. I have been crucified with Christ. He's saying, I've left the law behind. I've been crucified with Christ. When I was baptized into his death. And so I've been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. And so in baptism, you go into the water and you come up out of the water. You die to sin in the law. You come alive to righteousness in Jesus. So there's this big divide between life lived under the law, where you're a slave to sin, whether you like it or not, and the new life, the resurrection life, where Jesus lives in you and you are now justified. You are no longer under sin, but you've been completely forgiven. And Christ lives in you. You are now united with him. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. So at the very center of this gospel is Jesus' love for us. And he gave himself for us. And then we are united with him in our resurrection as we come to him. And then he says, I do not nullify the grace of God. This is wonderful grace that he's given me, this new resurrection life. I'm not going to nullify that. For if justification comes through the law, then Christ died for nothing. If I go back and rebuild the law and now say everybody has to follow the law, once they've been baptized into Christ, into the new life, if I rebuild the law, then Christ died for nothing. You just nullify all that wonderful love and grace that Jesus showed us. And so this then, as I'm reading Galatians, is the end of the narratio, the end of Paul telling the story of his conversion and having met Christ and having encountered Cephas 3 times. And he kind of ends that narratio with a very strong statement about his death and resurrection in Christ and his new life in Christ. So next time in part 3, we'll go on into a more doctrinal part of Galatians. And in classical rhetoric, this would be called the confirmatio, or the confirmation. These are arguments in favor of his position. So what he's going to start doing now in chapter 3, he's going to start telling us why this new gospel, that you don't have to live under law, why that is really the truth and how it is consistent with what God has revealed in the past. Okay, well, that's it for now. We'll see you next time. So, bye now.